Are there any questions? Yes, over there, could you please, we have a microphone coming around to you. Yes.
You presented a graph whereby you showed the number of migrants coming into South Australia and then the loss. What do you know about the losses? So which people are leaving, or their qualities?
Yeah, it's a very complex issue, and particularly one of the corollaries of the upturn in international migration settlement since about 2004, 2005 is that more have left, and there has been a leakage out of some of those people that have come into the state. And this hasn't been just in South Australia. That the data has shown that in other states where people have been engaged in the regional migration program, that once the 2 years of qualification are up, that they many of them go back to the place to one of the capital cities. But it's that outmigration is actually a very significant proportion of it is Australian born and is long-standing Australian residents. And a lot of it is the movement overseas of young people, these gap years, this almost universal characteristic of young people having a year or so travelling overseas. And that's, remember, these are not just permanent movements but long-term movements as well, so it does tend to get picked up in that group. So that would be the two major groups of that, as well as just the regular return migration of established migrants. But you know, the migration is always a two-way process. You know, even during the heyday of settlement migration in Australia through the 70s and 80s, I remember having a discussion with Dr. Charles Price, who was the doyen of migration research in Australia, and his estimate was that probably about 28% of people who came as migrants in the 50s, 60s and 70s left, and most of them went back to their home country. So it is part of migration, this flow and counterflow. It's always been part of it, and you know, one of the things that I think we don't do enough is that we tend to think of migration as a one-way process, but migration sets up all sorts of linkages, and it really has to be looked at as a system which links Australia or South Australia with a whole bunch of other countries. And I think that changing that mentality away from one-way movement, the sort of the assimilationist model, if you like, of migration, to one which is a transnational model of linkages between origins and destinations, I think is really, really crucial.
Question at the very back.
Constance, yeah.
And then one down here. Or one down here.
Yeah.
Then one at the very back. Yeah, yes, you first.
Oh, okay. Two questions. First of all, very recently in the press, in the media, there have been what I feel may be speculations, or maybe more than speculations, that quite a lot of skilled migrant visas are in fact being used by employers for low-wage, unskilled workers. Do you have any information on this? And the second point was just to throw into your last remark, that in addition to people returning, migrants returning, a study I did on Malta quite a few years ago suggested that people go backwards and forwards several times over their lifetime, and this is very hard to get from the statistics.
Yep. No, thanks, Constance. I think just to answer the second one first, I totally agree that, and I think one of the points, and it's one of the things that Stephen raises, is that so much of our thinking about migration in Australia, and I'd say our statistics too, is rooted in the old model of permanent settlement, and doesn't allow us to capture that complexity of the mobility which is actually occurring. With respect to the this sort of brain waste suggestion that many migrants are not being moving into jobs which are commensurate with their skill level, there's no question that is definitely the case. The extent to which it's exploitation in terms of people doing their skilled job but not getting paid commensurately for it. I really don't know. I mean, we've done a lot of work with census data, cross-tabulating people's skill level with their job and with their income, and we couldn't find a correlation between migrants being paid less with the same skills. But what we did find is that there were many, many more migrants with skills who didn't have a job commensurate with those skills. And you could control for everything, and particularly with refugees. In the end, they were much less likely to have a job commensurate with their skills. And the only way you can explain it is discrimination. I mean, among employers and in the labour market. And it's something which I think is something we really do have to take real action about in Australia, that we have all the laws in place, but the reality is that we still have very significant discrimination in recruitment of workers. But the exploitation argument about wages and conditions has been raised a lot in the context of 457s, and I'm sure Peter will say something about that anyway.
I have a question right at the very back and then one in the second row.
Thanks. My question's about the economic prosperity for humanitarian entrants. It's a group of people that I've worked with over the last 10 years, and as you pointed out, the remittances that are going back to countries are so significant that NGOs and United Nations are reducing the amount of money that they're putting into refugee camps. My concern is that in our society in South Australia, it's the poorest people in our society who are supporting the poorest people. Now, as a white European, if I make a tax donation to Kakuma refugee camp, I can get that acknowledged in my tax. But for humanitarian entrants, some of them, even on an asylum seeker, Red Cross amount of money, are still spending almost half of what they receive back to that country. And I'm just wondering if you ever see a way that we might recognise that their contribution to the countries that they've come from is a legitimate humanitarian gesture.
Yep. No, several things there that I think are, which I would totally agree with. And one of the ironies in Australia is that most remittances are sent back by the people who can least afford it. And I've had discussions with governments in Indonesia, for example, where they've got a migration policy of trying to increase the skill level of people going to work overseas because they think they'll get more money back. And the reality is that skilled people tend to come from fairly well-off families in the first place and don't need to send remittances to their homeland. So in Australia, if you're looking at the people who send back remittances, they mostly are the people from refugee groups and from Africa. There's 2 points that you mentioned that I'd like to agree with. One is this issue, which really scares me, that some development assistance groups are suggesting that remittances can be counted as development assistance, that can be regarded as part of Australia's development assistance to the Pacific, that remittances are sent out, and the potential for actually reducing the amount of development assistance because of remittances, which I think is something which we really have to guard against. And I think the World Bank, in making these data available on remittances, are very conscious that they don't want it to be used in that way. The other point, I for a long time have been arguing that in Australia, I think we should take a look at our migration policy from the perspective not just of the benefits to Australia, but to its impacts on the origin countries. And I've written about this concept which I call a development-friendly migration policy, which would encompass a range of things, but really looks at and it's not saying that Australia doesn't look at the migration from its own, from the benefits that it's going to render to Australia, but are there things we can do to actually facilitate good benefits in those home countries? And maybe some sort of taxation relief for that type of thing is certainly one of those policies which I would regard to be looked at, because it certainly makes a lot of sense.
In the second row here, thanks.
Tibet. Is that on? Yeah. Tibet State Development. My question relates to business migration and whether there's much work that's been done in that area and the success or otherwise of that program in, I guess, investment in attracting investment into wealth-generating parts of the economy.
Yeah, I'm glad you said success or otherwise, because most of the research has said otherwise, really, that, in many ways these programs I don't think are very well conceived, because it assumes that someone who is a successful entrepreneur in Hong Kong on Friday can be in Adelaide on Monday and be a successful entrepreneur in Adelaide, in totally different business environments, totally different cultural environments and so on. There obviously is something there in terms of that could be done, but I know work in New Zealand is what I'm most familiar with in this area, because they really went into business migration in a big way and attracted very large numbers of people from Taiwan and from Hong Kong to come as business migrants to New Zealand, and almost all of them have not been successful in terms of setting up new businesses. I mean, they invest in the housing market, and rather than, and certainly that's the case now with Chinese migrants, that they bring in money, but it gets invested in the housing market rather than necessarily in new productive enterprises. I think there is something there, but it's probably more in the way of a relatively small program. To me, it must involve the local business community, and there must be a mentoring process whereby overseas entrepreneurs get the chance to actually be able to mentor and transition into the conditions in South Australia. So I'd certainly wouldn't reject the whole idea, but I think it probably has to be looked at as more of a small scale operation rather than a more mass migration.
I have one question myself. I was really interested in your statement about how we should look at population projections and your caution, the strong caution in those figures, how you showed us how those projections for projection B, for example, changed so enormously. And that then brought in my mind other issues such as the development-friendly migration policy and the question of dependency ratios. Our dependency ratios will tighten enormously in the next 40 years because of the ageing profile of the population. And part of the solution, we sometimes think, will be migration, and indeed maybe some of the sanguine hope in those projection B figures getting higher and higher are that that will help address the dependency ratio. But if the development-friendly migration policies work out and other countries have less need to send migrants, and indeed you were talking about the south-to-south migration being increasingly significant. To what extent does dependency ratio analysis factor in at all into this research?
Yeah. Well, clearly the migration ageing discussion is a very important one. The trouble about it is that migrants are younger, but they have very little impact on the age structure because we're dealing with such large, substantial populations that they come into. But not only that, they don't stay younger. Unfortunately, like the rest of us, they age as well. And it's overlooked at the moment that while 25% of our population that are born overseas, 33% of our population aged over 65 was born overseas, and that's because of the impact of earlier generations of migration. But this doesn't mean it can't have an impact. And in the intergenerational report, they see migration as having most of its impact through increasing productivity, increasing that productivity dimension through having it through that economic impact and offsetting ageing in that respect. So there's no simple silver bullet to dealing with population ageing. What's needed to cope with population ageing in Australia is a battery of things, and it's to do with increasing participation, it's to do with keeping people in the workforce longer. Migration has got a role, but it's a battery of things, some of which we've done, some of which we haven't done. It's ageing and migration is certainly since the publication of a UN article on replacement migration in 1990 has been a big issue. That report actually showed how many migrants were going to be needed by individual countries in order to keep their workforce the same size as it is today. And it was just astronomical numbers for many European countries. But and since then, there's been quite a debate in Europe about it. But like most things in migration, there is no simple one-to-one relationship, and it is a complex relationship, and policies surrounding it have to be complex as well.
Well, thank you very much, Graeme. Would you please join me in thanking Graeme for his Now, I have great